Some decisions change the course of our lives. But what if I told you that sometimes all it takes is one night? Quentin Tarantino is known for his daring ideas, his sharp scripts, and his passion for cinema. But before the fame, before the awards, before Hollywood, he was just another ordinary guy with an ordinary job, living a life that didn't seem to be going anywhere. During the day, he worked in a video store surrounded by movies he loved, but which belonged to other people. At night, he wrote scripts that never left the drawer. He had talent. He had dreams. But, like many people, the days turned into months. The months turned into years, and nothing changed. Until one particular night, he realized something uncomfortable. If he kept waiting, nothing would happen. He had to act. And that's exactly what he did. What happened that night wasn't just a moment of inspiration. It was a method. A brutally honest way of facing his own life and rewriting his own destiny. But what exactly did he do? And, more importantly, can this method work for you? Quentin Tarantino always knew what he wanted. But knowing what you want doesn't mean knowing how to get there. Ever since he was a child, he was obsessed with movies. While other children played in the street, Tarantino spent hours inside movie theaters, glued to the screen. He didn't just watch movies, he absorbed them. Every scene, every line, every camera movement was engraved in his mind as if they were hidden codes waiting to be deciphered. He wanted to understand how great stories were constructed. But there was a problem. He had no money, no contacts, and no training in filmmaking. At that time, studying film required money, and Tarantino couldn't afford a Hollywood college. With no alternative, he did what many people would do. He took any job. And that's how he ended up in a movie rental store. For anyone else, this would be an ordinary job, just a way to make ends meet. But for Tarantino, that video store was the school he never had. Every day, he was surrounded by thousands of films, organizing titles, recommending stories, watching everything he could. He began to notice patterns, to understand what made one script brilliant and what made another forgettable. But just watching movies wasn't enough. He needed to create. So he started writing screenplays. At first, they were bad, but he kept going. In the beginning, everything we do is bad. The first video you try to record is terrible. The first drawing you do looks childish. The first text you write makes no sense, but the only way to improve is to keep doing it. Tarantino didn't wait for inspiration. He wrote all the time. At work, at lunchtime, at night at home. He wrote dialogue inspired by the films he saw, created characters, tested stories. He didn't have a perfect plan, but he had an obsession. And this is where the part that many people ignore comes in. For years, even with all this effort, nothing really happened. He was stuck in a rut. Working, writing, working, writing. No money, no contacts, no opportunities. And this is exactly where most people give up. When they realize that their efforts aren't generating immediate results, they start saying to themselves, maybe this dream isn't for me. Maybe I'm not as good as I thought. Maybe I should accept reality and stop trying. But Tarantino didn't give up. He kept going, even though he couldn't see any progress. Because he knew something fundamental. Time will pass anyway. You can use it to build something, or you can waste it, waiting for a perfect moment that will never come. And then came the night that changed everything. It was on that night that Tarantino realized that it wasn't enough just to want to. He needed to act differently. And that night, he made a choice that would not only change the course of his life, but could be the key to anyone transforming theirs. What exactly did he do? Up until that point, Tarantino had spent years in a repetitive routine. Working during the day at the video store, writing at night without seeing any results, he was stuck in an endless cycle, and he knew it. But what had changed? What happened that particular night that started his real transformation? Tarantino says that, in a moment of clarity, he looked at his life and asked himself an uncomfortable question. What am I doing wrong? It was no longer a question of waiting for an external opportunity or a great inspiration. He knew that in order for his life to be different, he had to change himself first. There was no more fooling himself. The answer wouldn't be easy or smooth. He knew the mistakes were there, visible and painful. But instead of avoiding them, he decided to face them head on. He picked up a notebook and a pen and began to write. Every failure, every decision he knew wasn't right, was written down. He didn't spare himself. It was time to be brutally honest with himself. But identifying the mistakes wasn't enough. Now he needed to act. And that's when he did something simple but revolutionary. He created a list. But not just any list. Each item on this list represented a concrete action he could take to correct the mistakes he had identified. What he began to realize was that real change would only happen if he followed this list with action and consistency, day after day. He knew that if he didn't take action, everything would stay the same. That was the first step, to act, and act with determination. What Tarantino was doing wasn't just an attempt to improve, he was rewriting his own history. He understood that in order to become the person he wanted to be, he needed to take charge of his life and take the first steps. He was no longer waiting for something from outside. He began to create his own path. This simple and direct method was not a one-off invention. He wasn't just applying a productivity technique. He was delving into something bigger. He was applying Nietzsche's principle, become who you are. It's not about discovering a hidden essence, but about creating yourself from the choices you make. And the great thing was realizing that this method is not exclusive to Tarantino. Anyone can use it. The key to transformation lies in honestly asking yourself what's wrong and taking concrete action to put it right. And most importantly, acting without waiting for the perfect moment. Because, as Tarantino learned, time passes anyway, and the only choice is how you use it. Is this content making you reflect and sparking new ways of thinking? If so, click the super thanks button just below the video. It's a way to say thank you and help me bring more content like this to those who need to reflect on life. When Tarantino decided it was time to change his life, he wasn't just making a practical choice. His decision wasn't simply to abandon the routine for something new, but a deep dive into the concept of self-transformation, which goes far beyond superficial change. What he did that night was to begin a process of complete reconfiguration of his identity, based on a philosophical reflection on human nature and the power of action. He wasn't looking for a hidden essence that needed to be revealed. He was actively creating the person he wanted to be. And this idea of creation is not something new. It has its roots in some of the most profound philosophies the world has ever seen, especially those of Nietzsche and Dostoevsky. Although the philosophical concepts are ancient, their applicability to the modern world and everyday life has never been more relevant. Nietzsche, the philosopher who most influenced this way of thinking, challenges us to become who we are. This does not mean that there is a version of ourselves waiting to be discovered. For Nietzsche, this creation of self is a constant and dynamic process, made up of choices, decisions, and most importantly, actions. He suggests that identity is not something given, but something that is made. And that's exactly what Tarantino did in that notebook on the night that changed his life. It wasn't just a record of past failures or mistakes. Every word written, every reflection jotted down, was a concrete step towards building a more authentic and effective version of himself. He was shaping his identity actively, not passively, directly confronting his limitations and blind spots that he hadn't even known existed until then. This process of personal creation is not simple. Creating yourself requires deep immersion in who you really are, and more importantly, who you want to be. This involves a careful look at the mistakes you've made, but also an honest look at the fears and insecurities you carry. As Nietzsche teaches us, creating yourself is not an easy task, and it is far from being an act of self-affirmation. Creating yourself is an arduous task of constant renewal, a metamorphosis. It's not enough to follow the currents of life. It's not enough to wait for things to happen by themselves. You have to be an agent of change. For Nietzsche, self-transformation is not a task delegated to chance. It depends on conscious effort and the desire to go beyond the limits imposed by our own nature. Suffering, a central feature of Nietzsche's works, is not seen as an evil to be avoided, but as a powerful tool for self-knowledge and growth. From the moment we decide to act, we inevitably come up against obstacles, failures, and discomfort. But what Nietzsche suggests is that suffering is necessary for evolution, to forge us into better beings. Contrary to what many people think, suffering is not the enemy of transformation. On the contrary, it is the fundamental ally that makes true introspection possible. Suffering brings us face to face with our rawest reality, without masks, forcing us to grow. As Dostoevsky argues, suffering is a gateway to self-knowledge. It doesn't come to tear you down, but to reveal what is strongest in each of us. Suffering is what challenges us, shapes us, and forces us to deal with our own potential for transformation. In Tarantino's case, the perception of suffering was clear. He saw the discomfort of being stuck in a routine with no concrete results as fuel for change. He knew that if he didn't face up to the flaws in his life, if he didn't look his limitations in the face, he would never get out. Suffering didn't weaken Tarantino. On the contrary, it strengthened him. He used the discomfort of his stagnant life as motivation to break out of this vicious cycle. This kind of suffering, rather than being an obstacle, was the key to his growth. He exposed himself to discomfort with the courage of someone who knows that growth only occurs when you challenge the status quo, when you go beyond your own limits. This reflection takes us directly to the psychology of the ideal self. Each of us, at some point in our lives, has imagined ourselves to be the best version of ourselves. It's not an exercise in ego, but in self-knowledge. But contrary to what many people believe, the ideal self doesn't arise spontaneously. It's not something you find by chance. It's not a destination to be reached, but a constant construction. Tarantino didn't just see his mistakes as failures. He saw them as starting points for an idealized version of himself. He knew that his best version would not be a magical discovery, but a daily construction, a decision to be made every day, every step of the way. Tarantino's ideal self was not a distant dream, but a concrete version that he began to shape in his life from that moment of clarity. And this is where the concept of self-improvement applies. Creating yourself requires much more than just wishing for change. It requires conscious action. It's not about having good intentions or wanting to improve, but having the courage to take charge of your life and constantly make choices that bring you closer to your best version. Tarantino wasn't waiting for opportunities to come his way. He wasn't waiting for fortune to smile on him. He began to create his destiny, day after day, decision after decision. He was applying in practice Nietzsche's principle, become who you are, understanding that change begins with action, with the constant creation of what you want to be. He wasn't just changing his job or his routine, he was changing his identity, recreating himself. By applying this concept, Tarantino wasn't limiting himself to a simple desire to improve. He was reprogramming himself to actually create the life he wanted. He was embracing the discomfort necessary for transformation in acting without waiting for the perfect moment. He knew that the only way to transform his life was to be the author of the story he wanted to live. This self-creation is a constant. Throughout your life, you will continually redefine, rewrite, and improve yourself. And that's why this philosophy of constant creation resonates so well with Tarantino's method. But how can we apply this in our daily lives? How do we deal with the internal obstacles that most prevent us from achieving real change? When Tarantino decided it was time for a change, he wasn't just freeing himself from a routine without great results. He was freeing himself from something much deeper and more dangerous: the internal enemies that keep us stuck in stagnation. True change requires more than just desire or intention. It requires action, confrontation, and above all, the courage to deal with fear, procrastination, self-deception, and above all, the price of inaction. Fear is perhaps the biggest and most immediate obstacle anyone faces when deciding to change. The fear of failure, the fear of not being good enough, the fear of not living up to one's own expectations. Tarantino has had to confront this fear throughout his journey. For years, he worked in a video store, wrote scripts, and never saw the results he expected. The fear that his dream would never come true could have paralyzed anyone. But what he learned, and what many of us need to understand, is that fear cannot be avoided, but rather faced and used as fuel for action. As Nietzsche suggests, when you challenge yourself, fear is inevitable. But it shouldn't be the enemy. It should be the motivator that drives your decisions, even in the face of uncertainty. Fear disguises itself in many ways, especially when faced with the unknown. When Tarantino looked at his life that night, he realized that the greatest enemy of change was inaction, the continual procrastination of a better future. Procrastination is a sneaky enemy. It convinces us that we need more time, more preparation, more perfection. Procrastination is one of the greatest forms of self-sabotage. When Tarantino finally took an honest look at his life and decided to write down the list of actions that would lead him to his ideal self, he wasn't just breaking his mind's procrastination, but interrupting a cycle of waiting that many of us are stuck in. He understood that change requires a movement, a decision, not an expectation. Procrastination is often linked to self-deception, another insidious enemy of change. When you deceive yourself, You convince yourself that you are on the right track, even when you are standing still, not doing what should be done. When Tarantino realized that he could no longer fool himself, that waiting for the right time or the perfect inspiration was just an excuse, he finally began his transformation. He confronted his shortcomings, but more importantly, he didn't let self-deception stop him from taking action. He knew that if he continued to deceive himself, his life would never change. But while these internal enemies are the most immediate obstacles, there is an even more powerful factor that can undermine our transformation: the price of stagnation. The cost of not acting is immeasurable. As Nietzsche challenges us, the biggest mistake we can make is not failing, but never trying. Stagnation is a slow death, a symbolic death. When you don't act, when you don't challenge yourself, you start to die inside, you lose precious time, and over time, you stop being who you could have been. The worst thing is that we often don't even realize that we're drowning in our own inaction until valuable time has passed. Time waits for no one. Tarantino spent years writing without seeing great results, without recognition. But he knew that time would continue to pass anyway. And every day lost without action was a day he couldn't get back. Procrastination and self-deception can convince us that we have all the time in the world. But the truth is that by letting time pass without taking action, we become victims of our own fear. The fear of change, of failure, of insecurity makes us put off until tomorrow what we know we need to do today. And so time continues to pass, and the opportunity to change our lives slips away. That's the real cost of stagnation. It's not just the regret of not having done something in the past, but the realization that lost time is one of the greatest enemies of change. When you postpone important decisions, when you procrastinate, you not only lose the present moment, but you are putting the future at risk. And as time goes by, opportunities diminish, and the chance of transformation becomes more and more distant. The price of stagnation is not just the frustration of not achieving goals. It goes beyond that. It profoundly affects our mental and emotional health. Procrastination creates a cycle of internal frustration, a constant feeling that we are failing at something crucial. The symbolic death it causes is the feeling of being stuck, of living a life that is not in tune with what you are capable of being. Every day without action is a day in which you allow fear and self-deception to drive your life, instead of taking control and changing the course of your story. Tarantino didn't let time be his enemy. He understood that he had no more time to waste, and so he used every moment to write, to create, to plan the change he wanted to see. He wasn't waiting for the right opportunity. He knew that the only opportunity that existed was the one he created with his own hands. He began to transform his life the very moment he committed to action. Now you too are faced with this choice. Change is within your reach, but it requires you to face your fears, stop fooling yourself, and take action. The clock is ticking, and if you keep putting off your decisions, you'll miss the chance to create the life you really want. But the question remains, are you ready to face the cost of stagnation and finally make the decision that will change your life? Or are you going to keep putting off the inevitable? The power of change is in your hands. Throughout his journey, Tarantino has shown us that transformation doesn't come from a big external change, but from an internal choice. It wasn't luck or chance that led him to stardom. It was the decision to face his own life honestly, to look at his flaws and ask himself, what am I doing wrong? And that question, simple and painful, was the key to his reinvention. But when we look at his story, the real reflection that emerges is, what about you? What are you doing wrong? It's not just about changing your life, but understanding that in many cases, the answers lie within you, in the choices you have made so far. What's stopping you from rewriting yourself? What is holding you back? And more importantly, what are you missing out on by not making these decisions now? The change Tarantino experienced wasn't a matter of waiting for something big, but of making small choices every day. The most important reflection he leaves us with is about time. Time waits for no one, but it is not cruel either. It offers opportunities all the time. The question is, are you ready to see them? Or are you waiting for an external sign that may never come? The real challenge is not what you can achieve tomorrow, but what you are allowing to go unnoticed today. The chances of transformation don't lie in perfect moments, but in simple actions, in the daily choices that allow us to build the life we really want. Don't wait for the big change, because it will never come magically. It starts the moment you decide to look inwards and finally take responsibility for who you want to become. And, like Tarantino, you can also choose to act. Not because the world expects it, but because you're ready to create the most authentic version of yourself. If you've made it this far, you've already taken the first step. Now count me in. I'm here on the channel to help you continue this process of transformation, bringing you more stories, more reflections, and above all, more tools for you to rewrite your life. Don't stop here. Subscribe, explore other videos, and together, let's seek more wisdom, action, and real change. And remember, knowledge is the path to true freedom. Count on me and follow the White Rabbit.